Look at their personalities and who they were. Two of his daughters, Kulthum wa Ruqayya, sisters, were both married to the same man. Of course, not at the same time, but they were married to the same man. He was married to one of them, Kulthum first. Then when she died, he married her sister, who was Ruqayya. Look at the man that they were married to. Who were they married to? Uthman ibn Affan, radiyallahu ta'ala. A man of prestige, man of nobility, man of ilm, knowledge. And the Prophet ﷺ, he told Uthman, if I had a third daughter, I would marry you to her. I don't have any more. Zainab is taken and Fatima is taken. And the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned that Fatima, none of the women had reached the level of knowledge and the level of intellect like Fatima. And she was very close to the Prophet ﷺ. And these, for our sisters, these are our role models. These are your role models. These are the women that you follow. These are the women who you emulate and imitate. And this is how we allow our daughters to develop a sound Islamic personality and identity. Many of our daughters, they're confused. They don't know whether they dress like Muslims, but then they act like kuffar. They dress like Muslims on the outward, but internally they look like kuffar. When they take off the overgarment, everything after the overgarment look like what you see on TV. They're confused. As the kuffar, this is what they say about us. You're confused. You don't know whether you want to be religious or not. You don't know whether you want to be Muslim or something else. That's because the identity is not intact. And the only way that the women can put their role as believing women, as Muslim women in the society that we live in, is when you look at the lives of the women of the Sahaba. Rather, look at the women that were mentioned in the Quran. There were women that were mentioned in the Quran, as we're going to mention inshallah ta'ala, that had personalities that we have never seen from any of the likes of any other woman. Like Asiya, the wife of Fir'aun, who we're going to mention. Allah, to the point where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used her as an example of how to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ضَرَبَ اللَّهُ مَثَلًا لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. Allah puts forth an example for those who believe. Who did He use as an example? He used Asiya, the wife of Fir'aun. Not just for the believing women, but for the believing men. Allah puts forth an example for the believers in general, everybody. The wife of Fir'aun. Not to mention Maryam, the mother of Isa alayhi salam. Used as an example of how to be chaste, how to be righteous, how to be modest. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the angel to her to inform her she was pregnant, she said, when she saw him coming, she said, إِنِّي أَعُوذُ بِالرَّحْمَنِ مِنْكَ إِن كُنْتَ تَقِيًّا. She said, I seek refuge with Ar-Rahman from you if you are taqi, if you truly fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Back away from me. An example of how to be chaste. The daughters of the sheikh that married his daughter to Musa alayhi salam. When she came to Musa, تمشي على استحياء فقالت إن أبي يدعوك ليجزئك. She came to Musa and she walked towards Musa istihya'an, in a modest manner. And she told Musa, my father wants to reward you for, or compensate you for what you've done. All of these women that were mentioned in the Quran, these are examples of how to be. These are examples, and this is how you build your Islamic identity, how you build your Islamic personality as a Muslimah. Not by what you see on TV. As if it wasn't pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He would not have mentioned it in the Quran. Not to mention of how to be a wife to your husband. As being a wife to your husband in Jahiliyyah, maybe that was something that you learned from watching your mother and your father. But in Islam, being a Muslim wife, it requires a little more than that. And many of our sisters are at a loss because they don't look at the wives of the Prophet ﷺ and the wives of the men of the Sahaba to look at them and use them as an example of how to be with your husband. Sulaym radiyallahu ta'ala anha, who was the mother of Anas ibn Malik, when Abu Talha wanted to marry her, proposed to her, she said, مِثْلُكَ لَا يُرَدْ لَكِنَّكَ رَجُلٌ مُشْرِكٌ. She said, the likes of you should never be rejected. You're a good man, but you're a mushrik. I can't marry you. I'm sorry. The likes of you should never be rejected, but you're a mushrik. Look at the shakhsiyah, look at the personality of this woman. She said, but I tell you what, if you accept Islam, I'll make your acceptance of Islam my dowry and I won't ask you for anything else. Many of our women, when a kafir approaches them, you just look into his eyes and you fall into his hands. You forget all about your deen. You forget all about your Lord. You forget all about your hijab. You forget all about your reputation as a Muslimah. This woman, she wasn't impressed by what he looked like, or what his character was, or what his reputation was. She said, the likes of you should never be rejected, showing that she knew who he was, that he was a good man. The likes of you should never be rejected. Meaning, if someone like you proposes to a woman, he should never be rejected. But in this case, you're a mushrik and I'm a Muslimah. She made it clear who she was, and she wasn't willing to compromise. And the examples go on and on and on and on. But we're saying to ourselves and to our wives and to our daughters, at what point, at what time do you start to take on these roles and implement this in your households? Implement this within yourselves. And the only way that the woman can increase in these type of characteristics is when she takes time out of her busy schedule, her busy lifestyle, and learn about these women, to see that this was the type of characteristics that they had, this was the type of personalities that they had, and likewise you fashion and you mold yourself to be like that. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions in the Quran, as He mentions about what the woman should be doing, the Muslim woman, her role, He says in the Quran, وَاذْكُرْنَا مَا يُتْلَى فِي بُيُوتِكُنَّ مِنْ آيَاتِ اللَّهِ وَحِكْمَةِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ لَطِيفًا خَبِيرًا. And remember, as He's addressing the Muslim woman here, and remember that which is recited in your houses from the ayats, the ayats of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and from the wisdom, meaning the sunnah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here telling the woman how her household should be conducted. How should she conduct her household? Your household should be conducted or should be filled with the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether by the Quran or whether by mentioning the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as he said, وَاذْكُرْنَ مَا يُتْلَى فِي بُيُوتِكُنَّ. And remember what is recited in your houses, meaning, O you women, from the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the ayats of Allah, and from the hikmah, meaning the sunnah. And indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Latif al-Khabir. قال Imam Sa'di rahimahullah ta'ala in his tafsir of this ayah, المراد بآيات الله القرآن والحكمة أسراره أو سنة رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم والأمر هنا بالذكر يشمل تلاوته ومعناه وبتدبره والتفكر فيه لأن هذا هو المقصد الأعظم من القرآن. That Imam Sa'di rahimahullah ta'ala, he said about this ayat, he said that the meaning of the ayats of Allah here is the book of Allah. And the meaning of hikmah here is the understanding of the Quran